Okay, all right. So hi everyone. My name is Tina Closius. I'm going to be doing the training today on resilience. So I'm going to share my screen and so you guys can follow along with the presentation. So I know that Jenna said she'll be helping me with kind of managing the chat. Technology is not always my strong suit, so hopefully we don't have a lot of glitches and this will go pretty smoothly. I know that Jenna said she'll try to help manage some of the chats, but so if anything comes up, any questions or feedback, feel free to put anything in that chat. And we'll also have time at the end to, have an open discussion or any questions or feedback, and we can kind of go from there. All right, so I'm just gonna start my screen share. And I think if everyone wants to mute themselves for now, and I think that might also help. I actually am here on my phone as well, just because my Wi-Fi has been a little disruptive, but so please let me know if there's any echoing. I did mute myself, so hopefully it should be fine. And can you guys see my screen okay? Maybe I have the chat open still. Yes, okay, great. Perfect, thank you guys. All right, so let's get started. All right, so like I said, my name is Tina Closius and I'm gonna this training is on resiliency. So I am the clinical supervisor with the Center for Victim Safety and Support, CVSS program here at Family Services. I started actually at the beginning of this year, so I'm still relatively new, so almost 6 months, which is pretty crazy. Which has been really wonderful. I moved here from Connecticut last September. Just wanted to give you guys a little bit of background about me. I have my license in clinical social work as an LCSW, and I have been for a couple years. Most of my professional experience has been working within the mental health field. Before here, I was a primary clinician on the inpatient psychiatric unit for adolescents at Yale New Haven. I've been an in-home therapist for youth and families, help co-facilitate groups, have some private clients. And so, a lot of the clients that I've come in contact with most of them have really experienced trauma and also demonstrated a lot of resiliency. And so I'm really interested in this topic. I thought it was a great fit for me. So I am really happy to be here with you all today and excited to share some of my knowledge and experience and hear from you guys as well. All right, and I think I already mentioned this, but in case anyone's new, if there are any questions or thoughts, feedback, feel free to put in the chat and we can kind of go through it as it comes up. And there definitely will be time at the end to go over that as well. Okay, so the first slide I have is what is resilience, right? You're really giving an overall picture of what this is. Resilience is the process of adapting well in the face of adversity, trauma, tragedy, threats, or significant sources of stress. Really the ability to bounce back, the ability to mentally and emotionally cope with a crisis or return to a pre-crisis state quickly. Resilience is really a huge topic, but today we'll really just be focusing kind of on the basics of resiliency. This also might be a refresher to some or might sound familiar to those who went to the report of the community a couple months ago. There was our keynote speaker, Dr. Tony Salerno, and he did a training beforehand on the BRIGHT program, which I'll touch upon a little bit later. And he had really talked a lot about resiliency. Also, he was really entertaining and made it really a great topic. So some of this might sound kind of familiar to others as well. So resilience also is also kind of known as that pulling yourself up by your bootstraps type of mentality. So people who are really able to bounce back and kind of work through a traumatic event or incident that may happen to them. So the next slide, so this is a video. I'm hoping that this works. It's just kind of a little cute video on what resilience kind of looks like or what it could look like it was a little hard to hear before, so I'm hoping it's okay, but it's kind of not necessary to have sound, but so here we go. Let's give this a shot.
The fuck is this shit? Yeah.
Okay, so within that little video, I don't know. Now might be a good time to just, if you guys wanted to enter any thoughts into the chat on what maybe you guys noticed that kind of demonstrated resiliency. I noticed that there was a lot of adapting, right? There was people really trying to work together as a community. There was support, a lot of supporting one another. Oops, let me see, sorry. So yeah, thanks for the feedback about the video. So, I don't know if anyone has any other thoughts about what they noticed in that video, but I thought it was a great way to, demonstrate what resilience could really look like. I'm sorry, can you guys hear me? Can you guys hear me now? Sorry about that. Okay, I'm sorry. I was muted. I apologize. I was just reading some of the chat things out loud. So I love that feedback. Yeah, so that there was a lot of adapting, showing that we're not alone, that the little shapes became flat in order to float, that we need each other to get through things, and that also helps other people get to dry land. Yeah, so that was great. Thank you guys all for that feedback. Okay. So yeah, that video I thought really, really showed that, how much community is a part of resiliency and kind of working together, right? So that's a big part. Okay. So I also wanted to touch base about, what maybe is not an example of resiliency and how because it can be a little confusing or convoluted at times, right? So there are instances where things are mistaken for resiliency, and I just wanted to kind of talk about that for a minute. So, being overly strong or stoic, right? People who may struggle or avoid talking about a traumatic incident. Overly taking care of others, not practicing self-care, being naive maybe, or having rose-colored lenses, thinking that resilience will just make emotions just go away, quote unquote, right? These are things that, sometimes doesn't necessarily mean that if we're doing this that we're not resilient, but it's, sometimes these things can also be confused as being resilient, and, they're not always the same, right? They don't always go hand in hand. So I just wanted to kind of take a moment to kind of clear that. I think those are great things to talk and learn more about. That it just doesn't always mean that people aren't resilient, yet it doesn't mean that they are at the same time. All right, so, when we kind of dive further into what is resilience, right, and kind of the basics about resiliency, we really can't talk about resiliency without talking about trauma. So, a little bit about a little bit about trauma. Trauma is an emotional response to an adverse, distressing, or disturbing event. So some examples of trauma are, experiencing or witnessing abuse, violence or neglect, sexual assault, rape, growing up with a parent who is abusing alcohol or substances, living with a parent who has severe mental health needs or has attempted suicide, incarcerated, experiencing medical or physical trauma, car accidents, war, neighborhood violence or gun violence. So, and those are just a couple. There's more. Obviously, there could be more examples of trauma, but those are just some examples. The ACE study, and I want to quickly kind of talk about this. I think there's actually another presentation coming up about the ACE study, so I won't get too far, too deep into it. But essentially, the ACE study was a really big study they did a couple years ago, and it gathered information from over 17,000 individuals, and specifically asking about 10 adverse childhood experiences. So asking people if under the age of 18, they had experienced 10 different types of trauma. And this was a huge, huge study. I'd encourage all of you guys to look it up if you're interested or wanting to know more, or go to the other trainings on it. But it was a really significant study, and the findings were really important to what we know now today about trauma and the impacts of trauma. So what we really found out was that trauma is common across all populations. Obviously, it affects different populations a little differently, but that overall they found how common it was for people to experience a certain type of trauma before they hit. Oh my gosh. Oh, was I muted that entire time? I'm so sorry, everyone. Can you guys all hear me? Okay. Have you been hearing me the whole time? Okay. So sorry. I just saw on my computer that it looked like I was muted. Okay. Sorry. Thank you guys for the quick chat. Sorry. Let me just go back to that. I apologize. So the trauma, it's common across all populations. It's different for, might impact certain populations differently, but that overall it's really common. They also found that there is a direct link between experiencing childhood trauma and an adult onset of chronic disease, depression, suicide, being violent, or being a victim of violence. They also found that the more types of trauma someone experienced, there was it increased the risk of health and social and emotional problems. So and lastly, people usually experience more than one type of trauma. So rarely was it only someone experiencing, only sexual abuse or only verbal abuse. So they had found that almost 2/3 of the participants in that study had experienced at least, one ACE is what they call them. And more than 1 in 5 participants had experienced 3 or more ACEs. So, it really is pretty incredible what they had found about, especially the link between trauma and the impacts that it can have on someone lifelong. And so how does this really, circling back, how and why is this really important to, our conversation about resiliency? So why is resiliency important? So, trauma is common. The impacts are severe and they can be lifelong, and resiliency is about how we can overcome and even prosper after experiencing a trauma. And so, knowing how impactful trauma can be and how common it is, it's really important to know, that's how important resiliency is, right? Is that's how we can kind of come together. And it really, resiliency really has a ripple effect, right? Starting at the individual level and then impacting families, communities, nations. And so, even if we think about the impact on, that like COVID is having, right, on us as a nation, as a community, even within our families, and how we see in times of trauma like this, or even other national examples like tragedy of 9/11 or Hurricane Katrina, we always hear about how people come together, right, and serve their communities and help one another, and setting up food drives, or how we can make masks and send them to people in the how we can share PPE, right? So there are so many examples of how resiliency, how it can be a ripple effect within the people we know, the larger scale all the way down to a smaller scale. Even if there's a personal tragedy in a family, and how neighborhoods and communities come together to really help those families that are in need, or when there was just a tragedy. So those are just some examples of how important resiliency is, and how much of a difference it can really make. And then lastly, there's, why is resiliency important, and focusing on resiliency is that, there is a lot of information on trauma, right? There's a lot of information on the symptoms of trauma, healing from trauma, a lot of different therapeutic approaches and interventions like TFCBT or EMDR, right? Strategies to help someone get through a trauma. But there really isn't as much emphasis on the resiliency piece. And this is a quote from Dr. Tony Salerno, who did that BRIGHT training. And he had said, focusing on what is strong and not on what is wrong, which I really liked. And, I thought it really provided a good example of how and why it's important to focus on that strong piece. That really speaks to that resiliency. Okay, so what makes someone resilient? So in my research, and what I had found out was that there is some genetic component to what makes someone resilient. Really, I think there will be a training coming up on trauma and the brain, and really we'll talk a lot about like stress hormones and how we react to a trauma. And so the genetic component for resilience is really about how do we respond to stress hormones? How does our bodies and our brain kind of adapt and react to that? The other parts that make someone resilient are really more, traits that we have. Some people with these skills are born with these capabilities, and others might have to work on them. But the capacity to make realistic plans and stick with them is really an important part of resiliency. Having good and effective communication skills, having positive views of self, and having a positive view of someone's, have their own abilities, right? Kind of knowing their strengths and their weaknesses. That's a really important part of resiliency. Identifying their self as a survivor or a thriver rather than a victim. Someone who has that kind of mentality might view themselves as someone who's getting through something in a positive, positive way after that trauma, rather than seeing themselves as a victim. Again, these aren't all, all the time, but these are just helpful qualities that can make someone make someone resilient in general. High emotional intelligence and emotion regulation skills. So being able to kind of regulate how we're feeling and find that balance in how we're feeling, right? If we are able to recognize that maybe we're starting to feel incredibly depressed or feeling really angry, and how we can kind of manage and keep our emotions in check. And that also helps with making realistic plans or making effective decisions, things like that. Having an internal locus of control, which is an internal locus of control is believing that you have control, over what happens in life, and kind of what you have control over what happens to you. So people who think this way, they found that it helps people. It leads to more motivation and taking action steps towards changing, because they believe they have some control over it. Versus an external locus of control, just for some comparison, is when you don't really believe that you have any control over what could happen. So it might be kind of that mentality of, well, it doesn't matter, because I don't have control over it. Things are just going to happen, and it might lead people to not maybe not taking as much charge as they could have or would have if they think that they're, how they change things or it's going to make a difference to them and to their future. And so lastly, having strong established connections to the community. And I think this is a really important one. So, and we saw it a little bit in that video too. So, having connections either through your, any faith-based organization like a church or mosque or anything like that can be incredibly helpful. Having connections to different agencies or programs or mentorships or even, school programs, clubs, anything that really helps people feel connected, that they have other people outside of themselves that they can rely on, that they can talk to. So the good news is that if we don't have these, a lot of these things can be kind of learned or worked on, whether it's, through people through themselves or through therapy or through using their support systems. But a lot of these things can be really worked on if people don't feel that they have them naturally. Okay, so how do we become more resilient? So, for the self column, we have, learning to let go. I think this is both sometimes physically and kind of emotionally, mentally, learning how to kind of move forward, right? Altruism, so believing, practicing that selfless concern for, for the well-being of others. Acts of kindness, seeking support, practicing gratitude, learning from experiences, remaining hopeful about the future, self-care, reframing your thoughts, being proactive, focusing on what you can control. So these are, things that we can kind of do and keep adding to that list of traits, as far as how do we kind of keep becoming, how do we build upon our resiliency? How do we enhance it? And the practicing gratitude and the altruism one, I think are really, are really important, right? Is that kind of, and that kind of goes hand in hand with that community piece, and being there for other people and showing that we're present for other people. And that helps others just as much as it helps ourselves. And seeking support also kind of goes with that of, leaning on other people that might be in our lives and that might be able to help us. That is, being some might say, sometimes it might be being vulnerable, and kind of showing that we need that support is actually a strength, right? And can really show other people that, building that kind of community environment and how to improve upon things. Remaining hopeful about the future. And I think this kind of goes back to where some people, where maybe some common misconceptions of, being naive, especially if people are going through a trauma, or have just gone through a trauma, and there's this kind of potential for people to think that being hopeful, is kind of being naive. And those are really two separate things, because being hopeful about the future is more of, I can't control, what just happened, or we can't change the past. But how do we know that, acknowledge that, and still find a way to remain hopeful? And doing so really does help improve and enhance our resiliency, because it lets us keep going, right? It keeps us motivated. It's not keeping us kind of stuck in that. And of course, there's always, it's important to process our traumas and what's kind of happened to us, but it's different than being kind of stuck and not hopeful at all about the future. And that's kind of the same thing with reframing our thoughts and being proactive and kind of being mindful of how that trauma, may have affected us, either on an individual level or a bigger level, and taking care of ourselves and regulating ourselves, and also still being hopeful about the future and moving forward and being proactive. And then the focusing on what you can control. And, I think that, I don't know about anyone else, but I think with COVID kind of going on, with times like these or with other traumas, there's always that element of not feeling in control. We can't control a lot of things that are going on right now. And how do we acknowledge and be mindful of that feeling, and purposefully, focus on what we can control, so we feel more regulated. We feel a little less anxious, knowing that those steps, and that kind of goes back to that internal locus of control, knowing that, some of the things that we can control will make a difference to us, and that they matter. And then for others, so these are just different, programs and things that I had found, that are ways to help other people feel or become more resilient. So the 7 C's is a strategy or a program that has been implemented, and it's really for youth, these 7 C's. So competence, confidence, connection, character, contribution, coping, and control. And this is really, aimed for youth, and aimed for adults, whether it's, professional or personal, but to utilize and really give youth giving them that unconditional belief in their abilities. And they found that holding youth to high expectations, but with using that kind of unconditional belief mind frame, was really helpful in building their resiliency, particularly with a focus on, how it impacts their character, their coping strategies, right? And that contribution piece, right? We go back to that altruism, acts of kindness, practicing gratitude, but that contribution part really, again, seems to kind of come up again and again, the importance of resiliency and that, that discussion. Competence and confidence, I like that one too, and connection, of course. But the confidence, right? That unconditional belief in other people and keeping them to that standard is, again, kind of came up again and again, as incredibly important to someone's resiliency. And the BRIGHT program, kind of like I mentioned before, is a program that's relatively new, but that Dr. Tony Salerno, who did that training in the keynote speech, he noticed that there really isn't a lot of programs or emphasis on resiliency as much as there is on trauma. And so he had created that this program that it's a group therapy approach, and it really focuses on skill-based, it's a skill-based intervention group for enhancing resiliency, which is really great. I think it's one of the only ones in existence, because he noticed that there was a really big gap. And so that's a really cool program that he created, and that people can adapt into different programs. And then lastly, offering support on an individual, family, or personal community. So whether it's work related or not work related, but kind of starting to implement some of these strategies and skills that we've mentioned here, and how do we bring that to other people, and offering that support. And then obviously, seeking professional help, whether we notice ourselves individually that we're struggling with being resilient, or feeling like we're able to get through a trauma, or encouraging other people to seek help if they need it as well. Okay, so I wanted to also address how, what resiliency is within family services, and kind of what it means to us as an agency, and how we're seeing that, and how we're offering, how our services that are being offered really have a lot of resiliency kind of intertwined into it. And so, I wanted to focus on our mission statement overall, which is our, family services brings people together to find the support they need, improving their lives and communities, and building a stronger, safer Hudson Valley. So I wanted to kind of point out, some keywords that I noticed, in there that really kind of talk about and demonstrate resiliency: together, support, building, and stronger, right? All those words really kind of, emphasize resiliency. We're, together, support, building, right? And I love that word building, because it really talks about building. To me, just kind of means that we're doing it together, right? It's not us or someone, fixing something for someone else. It's kind of, how do we do it together as a community, as, as an agency, and becoming stronger, right? Stronger, it's kind of self-explanatory with resiliency, but again, stronger, meaning that, like, we will be stronger than we were before. We will learn from, experiences, and we'll take all this in, and how do we enhance it even more to make it stronger? So I really like that. And even kind of looking at all of the services that we offer. We offer behavioral health services, victim services, programs for families, for youth, community safety and prevention. So we're not only, talking about the aftermath of trauma, or of something that, is again kind of in response, although that's incredibly important. We're also focusing on prevention, right? And, that also kind of speaks to how to build resiliency. We're addressing the before and the after. And last year we served over 19,000 children, adults, and families, which is huge. And how that really instills, resiliency, within our community, and with all those that we've worked with. And lastly, the Family Partnership Center, excuse me. And so, this really provides a community with accessibility to related programs and nonprofits, which instills interconnectedness and collaboration between community programs to better serve others. And this is all really clear on the website too. I just wanted to bring it to this training to emphasize how much resiliency is already, within us and within our agency. But the family partnership, it fosters the value of community, and enhances the resiliency within our participants, within our agency, and within our local community. And so kind of leading by that example, right? It's already right there, about the importance of being interconnected, and an open collaboration, and seeking support from one another. And how that helps with community members, having accessibility to all those different types of programs. So I just wanted to point that out. I think it's really great that there's, those are just some examples of resiliency that we already have. Okay, and then how do we use this to help keeping others? So, or how do we use this to keep helping others, excuse me? So, we want to, obviously, it's always good to start at the individual level, right? So whether it's in our personal lives, our professional lives, anything like that, always kind of starting with ourselves and what we can do is always great. So again, whether it's just offering your support to other people, kind of acts of kindness, things like that, those are always great ways to start. Spreading awareness and education on resiliency, right? So kind of, stuff that we talked about today, and already starting to be mindful of, again, not even so much the trauma aspect, but kind of the building upon those strengths, focusing on what is strong and not what is wrong. I really like that quote. But that's a really helpful way to kind of remember what that, in a nutshell, what's that difference between the trauma and the resiliency, is that focus on the strength, focusing on how do we build upon that. So using a quote trauma lens to understand our clients, our participants, even our our loved ones, etc. So a trauma lens, just so that we all know, is really using a trauma perspective to understand and to respond to people's behaviors that might be that might have been impacted by trauma. So kind of understanding the impacts of trauma, what it can do to people on an individual level, and using that kind of lens to understand other people in our lives. I hope that made sense. But that will really help us to know, okay, when we look at things through the lens of a trauma and what they may have experienced and how that may have impacted them, it really helps us to relate a little bit more and to understand their needs, and then to help understand how we can also help them grow, right? And how we can focus on that resiliency piece. And that always helps, that trauma lens. And using a trauma lens also really promotes a culture of safety, of empowerment, and of healing. So, again, when we kind of know about trauma, it really does help that awareness, because again, looking back to that study of how incredibly common it is, the chances are is that a lot of people that we come across have experienced a trauma or two, and not to say that it's an active, an active struggle, but it can just be a helpful lens to understand people, especially within our work. And then using a strength-based and trauma-informed perspective, again, that trauma piece of just kind of understanding. And again, it doesn't necessarily mean, it never really means justifying anyone's behaviors because of trauma, but it just helps us to understand maybe the why piece, and to help understand how maybe or why someone's kind of reacting, or behaving a certain way, or things like that. Obviously, it depends on the situation. But that's that kind of trauma-informed perspective. And using a strength-based perspective, again, is using strength-based is really using an individual, family, group, community, etc. Personal strengths that already exist that will help to aid them in their recovering, and in their healing. And so, a strength-based, again, going back to my favorite quote, but focusing on what is strong, not what is wrong, it kind of goes in line with a strength-based mentality and modality of building upon someone's strengths that are already there to help enhance that resiliency. And then lastly, using implementing those strategies, into our existing programs, for youth, adults, families, community, people personally or professionally, but implementing some of these things, using strength-based approaches, using a trauma lens approach, or weaving other parts of different strategies into current programs. Whether it's connecting the youth that we know to mentors, or connecting families to different support groups, or helping someone get connected to counseling, things like that. So how do we now take what we know, and use it to enhance people's already natural resiliency. So these are just some ideas and about resiliency. So like I said, it's a really big topic, but I tried to just give a couple of the basics around it. I think that's actually the last slide that I have. But these are some of the resources, and I wanted to, I know it's a little shorter, I tend to talk fast, but I wanted to open it up and see if other people had either questions or comments, or maybe even examples of resiliency that they've seen, whether it's through the program that they work for within family services, or even nationwide. I know that there's a lot of examples out there about how we've come together as nations and as communities, and they're all really powerful. Resilience can be a really powerful thing, that I think is important to address every time we talk about trauma. It should be right there with it. So I'd like to open it up now. If anyone had any thoughts, questions, feedback, I really appreciate everyone's time, and stay with me through this. So I don't know if it's easier or better to unmute if you had something you wanted to share or say, or we can use the chat. Oh, thank you very much. That's very nice. I appreciate it. Yeah, if anyone has any maybe examples of resilience that they can think of that they feel comfortable sharing, obviously no pressure. Thank you. I'm just reading some of the chats. Someone had said, thank you for a great presentation. Thank you for this info. Appreciate being connected with the helpful programs at Family Service, especially these trainings that help us while we are cut off from so many. Yeah, of course. Yeah, Family Services does have a lot of really great programs right now, and has really come together with everything going on with COVID, which kind of demonstrates resiliency as a community. So, absolutely. Will I be sharing the presentation? Yeah, I believe Jenna, I believe you're recording it, so I think it should be available. Jenna, is that right, or?
Yes. Yep. It'll be posted. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you, everyone, for the feedback. Oh, will I be sharing it outside of the video recording? Do you mean like, should I send it somewhere, like the actual slideshow, or? Not sure if that's what. I could send it. Jen, could I send the slideshow presentation for it to be distributed? Is that possible?
We are working on doing it externally, but internally it can be sent.
Okay.
We can tie probably the actual slideshow to the post internally, Jamie. Yep.
Okay. This was helpful for myself, caregivers, to remind ourselves to take care of number one, so we can continue to encourage our loved ones and consumers effectively. Yeah, definitely. Thanks. Absolutely right. It's always like that airplane analogy. I'm sure you guys have heard it, but with the oxygen coming down, and how the airplanes always tell us to put it on ourselves before we put anyone else. And yeah, I mean, we can't take care of other people effectively if we can't take care of ourselves. And so, it's really important to remember that, especially when we're all facing trauma, is that we have to take care of ourselves first and foremost. And sometimes it's not always easy or realistic, but it's always important to remember to try that, do that the best we can. It also really helps prevent burnout, and helps people, bounce back really quickly. Yeah. Oh, good. I'm glad the references are helpful. Yeah, and you can also find out I think I put, if you guys look up ACEs, this bottom one, the ACE is too high, there is a way for you guys to see for free, what your ACE score is and what kind of questions they ask. Like I said, I think there's another presentation on ACEs, so I didn't want to get too into it, but there is a way to learn more about it if there's an interest in kind of seeing what that study is. There's a lot of research on it, just in case you guys wanted to know a little bit more, yeah. Okay. If there's anything else, I'll wait another minute, but I wanted to thank you all for joining and for participating, in this topic, and thank you for the feedback. It was really great.